Hi, I'm Benji from Singletrack magazine, and I'm here to walk you through the new Scott Ransom. What is the Scott Ransom? It's a mountain bike with 170mm of travel, progressive geometry, and a 6-bar rear suspension layout. This top-tier 900 RC model is fully carbon. The models in the rest of the Ransom range are a mix of a carbon mainframe and alloy swing arms. Much like the recently revamped Scott Spark and Scott Genius, the new Scott Ransom has moved to a hidden rear shock design. Unlike the Spark and Genius, the Ransom's rear shock is positioned horizontally as opposed to vertically. So yeah, the Scott Ransom is a full suspension mountain bike with 170mm of travel at each end. 170mm. What genre of mountain bike does that make the Ransom? In previous years, a 170mm bike would purely be an enduro bike. Possibly a bike park bike, maybe? I'd say that the new Scott Ransom can definitely still be pressed into enduro race duties, but it's possibly rather too sophisticated to be a bike park shredder. Yet, I think it would behave perfectly well as a trail bike, dare I say, all-mountain bike. To some ears, a 170mm travel trail bike may sound rather eye-rolly, but honestly, with modern bike geometry and sorted suspension, it really is amazing how normal a 170mm bike can feel just riding around. I'd make a strong argument that a bike like the Ransom is the true do-it-all mountain bike. It's not going to be ideal on an XC race course, but for everything from marathon, trail bikes, all the way through to enduro race duties, a long travel bike like this will do it all. A well-executed long travel mountain bike can do things that short travel and mid-travel bikes can do. It does not work the other way around. It's bikes like the Scott Ransom that are the quiver killers in the real world, not mid-travel machines with burlier parts swapped in. On a related note, the Scott Ransom has a trick up its sleeve, or rather on its handlebar. This item is the track lock remote. It only controls the rear shock, it's not attached to the fork. The rear shock is a custom version of a Fox Float X called the Fox Float X Nude. With the track lock, you can switch the rear shock through 3 different behaviours. Position 1 is fully open. Actually, fully open is not the correct term. You can set the shock's rebound and low speed compression circuits as with a regular shock. Position 1 is this setting. Position 2 closes off an extra air chamber that the Float X Nude has, which is essentially like suddenly sticking a gigantic volume spacer in the rear shock. It firms things up significantly, reduces the available travel to around 130mm, and also makes the bike ride higher in its dynamic sag. Position 3 increases compression damping. You could call it a lockout, but it's not technically locked out in the traditional sense. There's still a bit of movement possible, it's just mega firmed up. Right then, onto the science bit. This rear suspension design is called a 6-bar design. This means there are 6 rigid links in the array. You can kind of think of it as a horse link 4-bar, but with a bar from the top rocker meeting another bar that rotates around the bottom bracket. The chainstay bar also attaches to this around the bottom bracket bar. It's one of the more complicated designs out there. Why have Scott done it this way? Well, it gives them the suspension kinematic that they want, whilst preserving the bike's overall practical packaging. Whilst it may be possible to get this suspension kinematic via a relatively traditional 4-bar design, i.e. similar anti-squat, anti-rise leverage ratio, etc., it wouldn't be possible to have the frame look like this. The dropper post insertion would be compromised, as would the standover, and you'd be unlikely to fit a full-size water bottle in that front triangle. And yep, you wouldn't be able to have the hidden shock. Which brings us to a commonly asked question. Why have a hidden shock? I'm sure there are some pure aesthetic reasons. It just looks cool and unique, which is something that's harder to achieve these days as more and more mountain bikes start to look the same. But as any UK mountain biker watching this will probably already have thought of, hiding the rear shock away keeps it away from filth. Not having the rear shock continually exposed to the elements will have a genuine effect on the shock's longevity. As well as the seals of the shock itself, there are bearings in the eyelet of the shock that will last exponentially longer due to them being protected from regular dousings. In terms of the potential extra faff involved in having a hidden shock, well, for a start, how often do you actually access the rear shock once you set it up over the course of a couple of rides? Not very many. And when you do need to adjust or set up the rear shock, it's probably easier than you think. The cover on the underside of the down tube pops on and off very positively, no tools, no faff. When it comes to setting sag, it's not done via an O-ring on the rear shock. There's a sag indicator built into the main BB pivot housing. Let's get nerdy for a moment. Sag measured via an O-ring on a rear shock shaft is often inaccurate. This is because the amount of shock stroke is not equally commensurate with the amount of rear travel at the wheel. E.g., 30% of sag at the shock can often mean nearly 40% of sag into the actual wheel travel. Why? Links and levers and stuff. So ultimately, the sag displayed via the Scott Ransom's little dial is actual accurate sag. To continue the nerdy theme, let's talk about suspension kinematics. The leverage ratio is 25%, and looking at the curve of how it is delivered, the Ransom 6 bar is fairly leveragey around sag point, but quickly ramps up and then plateaus. What does that actually mean? It means it'll be supple at sag for decent traction, but quickly offer up some support in the mid-stroke for decent bike handling at velocity. Anti-squat numbers never dip below 100%. The range goes from 104 to 139% throughout the gearing range. Again, what does this mean? It means it should be an efficient pedaler in all gears. The anti-rise is perhaps the most interesting number. Anti-rise is how much the action of braking compresses the suspension. The anti-rise on the Scott Ransom ranges from 58 to 71%. This is a rare quality on a mountain bike. Usually the anti-rise figure drops and drops severely once into the travel. What does all this mean to the rider? Ultimately, the suspension stays active and supple even with the anchors slammed on. Clearly, the rear suspension design is something of a modern marvel, but as we often say, a mountain bike lives or dies by its geometry. Duff geometry equals duff bike. To quickly reel off some numbers about this large size Scott Ransom. The head angle is 63.8 or 64.4 with a neutral cup, or 65.0 with the cup flipped around. Seat angle is 77.4, BB drop is 25, seat tube length is a dinky 440, chainstays are also 440, and the reach is 483. This top tier Ransom 900 RC with the HMX series carbon frame is £9,799. The one down from this is the Ransom 910 with HMF carbon mainframe and an alloy swing arm. That's £7,799. Then we have the Ransom 920, £5,899, and the entry level Ransom 930, which is £5,099. What else before we conclude this video? The Scott Ransom comes with 29-inch wheels as standard, but it can be ridden with a 27.5 rear wheel via the flip chip in the chainstay. Oh, and that hatch for the rear shock access is also where you'll find some internal frame storage. So that's the new Scott Ransom. Head over to singletrackworld.com for a full rundown of all the Ransoms in the range, and keep an eye out for an in-depth review of this particular Ransom on site very soon. Bye for now.